Welcome to the first episode of the Competitive Strategy Interest Group interview series. Today we'll be talking with Nicole West from the University of Texas at Dallas about her paper Bad Medicine, Litigation, Competition, and the Marketing of Prescription Opioids. And this is a joint paper with David Tan.
Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome on behalf of the Competitive Strategy Interest Group of Strategic Management Society. This is our very first event of the recently launched interview series. Our aim is to invite authors of recent SMJ publications to have a brief chat on their work with the hope that this initiative helps stimulate more interest in strategic management research. So for our very first interview, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Nicole West. Nikki graduated with a PhD in strategy from University of Washington in 2023. And since then, she has held the position of assistant professor at UT Dallas's Naveen Jindal School of Management. Her research broadly falls in the domain of non-market strategy and more specifically in the areas of corporate political activity, stakeholder management, and social activism. A very warm welcome to Nikki, and thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be apparently the first in this series, so I'm excited to be here.
Thanks so much. And so, great. So now of this meeting, recently Nikki had an extremely interesting publication at SMJ entitled Bad Medicine, Litigation, Competition, and the Market for Prescription Opioids. Now, the paper is interesting for a plethora of reasons, but what immediately caught our attention is the fact that it centers on the prescription opioid industry, which offers a very novel context for empirical investigation. So without much ado, I will jump into the interview. And just to begin, Nikki, if you wouldn't mind, briefly talk about the context and the empirical setting, because that's what drew our attention to the paper at the outset. What are prescription opioids? And if you want to shed some light on the important details about the court case involving Purdue Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so prescription opioids are basically medication that's prescribed by a doctor to relieve severe pain. So that could include drugs like natural opioids like morphine and codeine, which you've probably heard of, as well as semi-synthetic ones like oxycodone or hydromorphone. So chemically, they're just different formulations of opioids. So they actually share the same basis as heroin, which means, they're really strong, potentially addictive medications. And they do have legitimate uses, but given their risk of dependence, they really should be carefully monitored and managed by a physician. So the court case that we end up using is Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Purdue Pharma, and it has several unique properties. So before this case, there'd actually been a bunch of previous litigation brought against Purdue by the federal government, and they settled in 2007 with the federal government for $634 million. And that settlement was meant to be shared among the federal government and the state governments. But Kentucky ended up turning down that settlement because it wanted to bring its own lawsuit against Purdue. And so in this Kentucky case specifically, it ended up actually being the first case where a member of the Sackler family, who owns Purdue Pharma, was deposed and basically had to answer questions about their knowledge of how addictive OxyContin, their opioid product, was, and Purdue's marketing practices. And the particular Sackler who was deposed came off as really smug and cavalier about Purdue's contribution to the creating the opioid crisis. And before this, the public didn't really know who the Sacklers were. They were big donors to arts and educational institutions. The public didn't really know much about them. So another unique event is that before this case, Purdue had managed to pretty much settle all of its other previous lawsuits, which means it prevented them from going to trial. And for Kentucky, there was some kind of chicanery where the lawyers for Purdue were trying to get the case remanded back to federal court, and it kept going between courts, and then it ended up staying in Kentucky. And then there was this kind of administrative error that Purdue's lawyers made where they didn't refile the plea in Kentucky. And then it ended up being automatically submitted as guilty, which meant this is the first time that this case would go to trial, and that would involve depositions and discovery and potentially making this information public. Purdue really didn't want people to know, how much Purdue knew and when they knew it about how addictive OxyContin was. And what also ended up happening is that Kentucky's lawyers were able to argue for the ability to share their discovery with lawyers from other government plaintiffs. And I think starting in 2014, there were some other local governments, which then ballooned into thousands of local governments that wanted to bring litigation against Purdue. And journalists were also successful in making a lot of the discovery public. So this was kind of unique in that now, for the first time, all this previously private information is coming out. It's drawing a lot more attention to both Purdue and the Sackler family, and just kind of putting them under a lot more scrutiny and potentially stigmatization.
Yes, so we were really interested in how you learned about the case, got interested into the specifics, and what was really the motivation at the outset about like using this sort of very novel setting for your research.
Yeah, so maybe this will be, I don't know, reassuring for PhD students out there, but this idea actually came out of my first year summer paper. So at the University of Washington, doctoral students have to, at the end of their first year in the summer, write the front end of the paper and then say where you're going to get the data from and the methods you'll use to analyze the data yet. This was 2017, and I was reading all these news articles about how like thousands of local governments were bringing litigation across a range of opioid companies. And I thought this was like a really interesting phenomenon because these local governments were effectively engaging in collective action and attempting to basically regulate through litigation because state and federal governments had failed to do anything to address the opioid crisis. So I thought, these local governments are almost behaving like social activists, except they're using institutionalized tactics to try and hold companies accountable for their negative externalities. So together with my advisor and co-author, David Tan, we ended up collecting data on all these thousands of lawsuits, which is very difficult, and looked for patterns in the timing of waves of lawsuits and Purdue's marketing expenditures and prescriptions of OxyContin. And then we noticed that there was this big drop in their marketing expenditures after 2015. And we were like, why 2015? There wasn't anything super obvious that stood out. But then we found this Kentucky case. And from there, we started to think about, how did competitors react to this? Because if you're trying to do something like regulate through litigation, that only works if all the other firms in the industry stop engaging in those same kind of practices or that same misconduct. And then we ended up finding that that's not what happened. So, yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting, very interesting. Now, I'm sure PhD students or aspiring doctoral students will have a lot to take away from that. I mean, research is a messy business. You go back and forth. When you're searching for data, you don't know what's in there. And sometimes you find very interesting patterns, and then you investigate, and then you have a paper which gets published in SMJ. Nothing like it. Great. So, but now what we were wondering is, in the paper, you juxtaposed two fairly independent streams of research, which are non-market strategy and competitive strategy. That is another that again, as I mentioned, the paper is interesting for a plethora of reasons, but this is another reason why this paper is so timely. But talk us a little through this, building on the counterintuitive argumentation that you introduced earlier on in the discussion in the paper, and also the one which you hinted during your previous question. Briefly referencing, I think, the stigma diffusion literature is what you call in the paper. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of, again, starting from this high-level idea that local governments could be using litigation as a means of holding firms accountable for their negative externalities, thinking about, how does that work? They're basically like trying to recoup costs, the social costs of the opioid crisis. And that's what a lot of other kind of tactics used by non-market actors are doing. They're trying to make engaging in some type of like unethical practice or misconduct really costly, and then draw attention to that unethical practice. And as more people become aware of these practices, they start to become stigmatized. And firms who continue to engage in those practices then would face a risk of becoming stigmatized or facing a penalty, maybe like a reputational one, or being the next target of litigation. So this sort of intuition in the stigma literature would suggest that firms don't want to take the risk of becoming stigmatized or facing these significantly costly penalties. So they're going to stop engaging in these stigmatized practices. And again, if like regulation through litigation works, then that's what we would probably see. But the thing is, stigma doesn't necessarily affect all firms equally. So there can be kind of like relative costs and benefits of engaging in stigmatized practices. So, firms are originally engaging in these practices because they're profitable. And then if they face competition from other firms, if the kind of effective stigmatization is unequal, they're going to have different costs and benefits of continuing to engage in these stigmatized practices. So we argue that even if use of these stigmatized practices becomes like increasingly costly for all firms in an industry, firms can still respond in heterogeneous ways if stigma does not affect all the firms equally, given competitive pressures. So you might have some firms that are like, oh, well, engaging in these practices, for us, the benefits outweigh the costs. We're going to continue to do so. And especially if they have competitors who are maybe more susceptible to stigmatization, those competitors might kind of decrease or stop their engagement in those stigmatized practices. And now there's an even greater market opportunity for those other firms to jump in and take. So yeah, that's the logic there.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting contribution, right? And then so moving on to the sort of the empirical part of your paper. So we were wondering if you could say a few words about the data set that you used in the study and the sort of the specific features that made it suitable for your research questions, right? And then also maybe touching upon what data is openly available from the Medicaid and Medicare, and how you use the date of the Kentucky case in the context of your empirics.
Yeah, so what's kind of interesting about this context is that it's basically in public health, and the federal government actually collects a huge amount of really fine-grained data on various aspects. And so what we end up using is there was the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which was enacted as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, which some people might know as Obamacare. And so this particular piece of legislation required manufacturers of drugs covered by Medicare or Medicaid, which is like in the US, kind of a lot of US has a kind of different medical system where a lot of it's private, you have private insurance, but Medicare and Medicaid is basically insurance provided through the government. So for drugs that are covered by this kind of like government insurance, they have to report payments to physicians above a certain threshold, these like drug marketers. So all this payment data is publicly available through the Open Payments Database, which is part of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So that's going to be the kind of regulatory agency that handles everything. And there's this database you can go find all this data at. And this data contains actually amounts of payments from individual companies to individual physicians. And we focus on payments for food and beverage, since other studies have documented sales reps taking physicians out for lunch or coffee as a key promotional strategy. And even Purdue Pharma in its own kind of things that came out during discovery said, yeah, this is a key part of our strategy, because then you're able to try and, influence them. That's basically why you're taking them out for coffee or lunch. And we linked that data set with another publicly available data set on individual physician prescriptions, which is from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Prescriber Part D database. This is going to have yearly physician level data for prescriptions that are covered by, I'm just going to say CMS, that's the Medicare and Medicaid Services. And another important aspect of this data is that it also includes a measure of the underlying health for a physician's patients, so that we can account for the possibility that some physicians are targeted for greater promotion efforts because they have less healthy patients who require more opioid prescriptions. So just incredibly fine-grained data. And then we're also able to identify competitors through a list of drugs and manufacturers that is from the US Food and Drug Administration's opioid analgesic risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. And then of course, once we come up with, okay, here are the different types of opioids, here are the companies who manufacture them, then again, we can go and link that data with this prescriber and open payments data. And then the last data that we used was also publicly available on opioid overdose deaths from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's multiple cause of death database.
Perfect. You used a lot of, yes, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just remembered you had so much, but then you had also asked about I think the court case and how that worked. So we used the event date of the court case, December 2015, as a way to kind of look at competitors' responses to this increasing scrutiny of Purdue. So I'd mentioned all those different aspects of the case that were drawing attention to Purdue and the Sackler family specifically, that weren't, it's litigation. It's not necessarily clear that other competitors are doing the exact same things. So the scrutiny is really just focused on Purdue. And so we use this case to look at how these promotional payments change for both Purdue and its competitors before and after the case.
Nice. So that's great. You used a lot of open source databases, and then you had this court case. Perfect recipe for definitive design, I guess. That's great. But getting on further with your empirical strategy, could you talk us through some of the mechanisms that you theorized earlier and how you're able to tease them out in the course of your empirical analysis? That would be great.
So we're again trying to look at if there's this increasing kind of scrutiny and stigmatization to Purdue specifically, how do competitors react? Are they like, oh, we're afraid that other people are going to think we're doing the same thing, so we're going to stop engaging in these same practices? And so litigation against Purdue specifically was alleging that they were using deceptive promotional practices, that they were actually, when they go out, take these physicians to lunch and coffee, saying that, don't worry, you can prescribe, as much OxyContin as you want, you can prescribe higher doses because it's really not very addictive. And you might see something like pseudo addiction where the patient looks like they're getting addicted, but the solution to that is just prescribe them more higher doses, more frequent doses. So they're pretty much just trying to get physicians to prescribe as much of this stuff as possible to boost their sales. And so we would think that if competitors are trying to avoid the penalties of stigmatization, then they would avoid promoting their products to the same physicians that Purdue had previously targeted, or to physicians who had prescribed OxyContin, because these are the physicians who have maybe kind of been like educated by Purdue to think, oh yeah, we can prescribe as much of this as possible and it's totally safe. And we would also especially think that they would avoid targeting physicians in areas with really high rates of opioid overdose deaths. So, so that's kind of what we look for, but I'll save our findings for this next part of the interview.
Yes, so jumping on this, what were some of the main findings of the study, right? So what did you find in the end?
Yeah. So we found that following the Kentucky lawsuit going to trial, Purdue significantly decreased their promotional payments to physicians, which we would expect that. But then we found that the competitors significantly increased their promotional payments to physicians. So just to kind of put this in perspective a little bit, in the 2 years prior to the case going to trial, Purdue spent $1.5 million on food and beverage to promote OxyContin, and in the 2 years after, only $54,000. So that's a decrease of 94%. And then for Purdue's competitors, on the other hand, in the 2 years prior to the trial, they spent $911,000 to promote competing opioids, but then in the $2.4 million. So that's an increase of 160%. And we also found that there was this significant increase in competitors targeting physicians who had not only previously prescribed OxyContin, but who had also been previously promoted to by Purdue. And Purdue significantly decreased its promotional payments to those physicians. So, these competitors showed basically no signs of avoiding promotional efforts targeted at physicians in areas with especially high rates of opioid overdose deaths. And that's probably as stigmatized as you can get. Yeah, basically the kind of pattern of results shows that, following increased scrutiny, especially on Purdue decides to decrease its use of these stigmatized practices. But despite increased scrutiny growing, in general for the opioid industry, Purdue's competitors were like, oh, Purdue's totally pulled back on its engagement in these practices. We see a market opportunity. Let's go and target Purdue's former customers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's very interesting, and indeed very, very counterintuitive. I mean, the counterintuition is probably I think, the most important theoretical contribution of this paper, that even though you are in the stigmatized industry as a competitor, you don't necessarily care about the stigma if the resulting profits outweigh the costs of the stigma. And that counterintuition, I think, it goes beyond this contribution, goes beyond theoretical contribution, and has very important policy implications as well. I'm sure the policymakers should be interested in this finding as well, and not just strategic management researchers. But just to conclude, before we conclude, what research questions do you think would be potentially interesting to look into as a to build into your paper to further take this project forward? And if you have been associated with some of these projects already, maybe you want to talk about these briefly before we conclude this interview.
Yeah, so we'd actually originally collected data on all those thousands of lawsuits that were brought by local governments against opioid companies across the whole supply chain. So we actually have lawsuits against opioid manufacturers, but also distributors and like even retailers. And some of these lawsuits also name the Sackler family specifically. So just thinking of the whole, or the kind of variety of defendants that are named in these lawsuits, one possible question that we're going to look into is, why do local governments choose to target some defendants and not others in lawsuits? Of course, there's the obvious answer, like, well, it's because these are the ones who actually had some role in supplying opioids to the jurisdiction, so they have reason, standing, all that stuff. But I think it's still interesting because if you think about stakeholders engaging in private politics, like they typically target the largest and most well-known firms, or those that they think are going to concede, and then they threaten them with reputational penalties. But local governments target like a huge variety of firms. They're targeting small ones and big ones. And just kind of based on these patterns in their targeting strategies, is there something that we can learn about how mass litigation might actually operate as a non-market strategy? So is it trying to have the same effect as regulation, where you just try and target like every firm possible that you can? Or are you trying to like amplify the potential for stigmatization by targeting more of these large firms? Because again, if you do win, those are going to be the ones that have the resources to actually pay. But then at the same time, some of these large firms are known to be particularly aggressive in defending themselves against litigation. So like there's this big risk now, because if you lose the case, you not only maybe lose that ability to stigmatize the practice or the company, but you also aren't going to get any money out of them. So it's actually, there's a lot of these kind of countervailing effects that could be happening with targeting decisions. So, in our first paper, we saw the limitations of a single lawsuit in attempting to try and regulate through litigation. But another thing we could look at with all this mass litigation is there like a threshold at which, now that this company has had like 1,000 lawsuits against it, or maybe only 500 or 100 or whatever, is that when you start to see these payments to physicians decrease? So yeah, I think a couple interesting questions could be looking at, are there threshold effects when mass litigation might actually start to serve as a bit of a substitute for regulation? And like which firms are targeted to try and reach that threshold?
Yes, thank you so much, Nikki. So I think that's sort of like a very good ending to this super interesting and insightful discussion. Thank you for your time again. It was really great to have the opportunity to learn a bit more about how you developed the idea, how you found data that would allow you to look at the questions around this phenomenon that was going on in the real world, and that has sort of like a very practical implications, right, and general welfare implications as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tanu, do you want to say a last few words?
Yeah, thanks so much to Nikki for agreeing to do this interview. It was really insightful, and we were both very, very interested in the paper. Now we are interested even more, and I hope this interview helps to take your wonderful research to a great variety of people, not just academics, but as I mentioned, to practitioners, to industry, to people in the industry, etc. And yeah, so have a pleasant summer, and all the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us for the first episode of the Competitive Strategy Interest Group interview series. In the next episode, we'll be talking with Weiyan Zhang from Tsinghua University about a recent SMJ paper.